All right, so today we are going to be talking a little bit about car hacking and how it can make your commute a little bit more interesting. First, let's talk a little bit about security in general, at a very high level. Security is fundamental. In our world, we have all of these devices and systems that rely on each other, but they're all, vulnerable to attacks if it weren't for proper cybersecurity measures. One of the biggest areas of security is data center security. Data centers are big, large facilities. We have thousands of computers in them, thousands of endpoints, and they all need to be secured. But data centers eventually get hacked. Just like all things, it's a matter of when you get hacked, not if you get hacked. And always what happens is, there's a weakest link in a data center. There's maybe an unprotected HTTP server or some kind of FTP server open or some kind of, application that you can exploit. But a chain is as strong as its weakest link. And, and then you have these big systems that get totally destroyed. Now cars, it's a little bit of a stretch here, but cars are almost like data centers. So like data centers, cars have hundreds of endpoints. But the endpoints are not really like user-facing applications, like in a data center. Instead, it's something like a gas pedal sensor, or maybe the computer that determines how much fuel and oxygen it should give the engine for optimal combustion. So there are a lot of different systems in a vehicle that make it very complicated, and all these systems talk to each other, right? So this is sort of like a data center where all the computers talk to each other. Now, if you get into, or if you find a vulnerability in one of these sensors, in one of these endpoints, then you can get into the rest of the car because they're all connected. And so in this way, car security ends up being an issue because vehicles are basically 1-ton bullets, and they're traveling at 70 miles an hour on the highway. And if you can hack one of these bullets, you could go ahead and swerve it into another bullet. And you could cause a giant traffic jam, and you could probably cause some major damage. So our objective for today is we want to basically hack a vehicle, a motor vehicle. So there are a few steps here. Number one, we have to get in a car. That's the biggest part. We have to actually have a car. And then number two is we have to hook up to the OBD2 port and read and write from the CAN bus. I'll get into what all this means later. Number three is we should tap into the ADAS systems because those systems have access to CAN, direct access to CAN. Again, we will discuss the ADAS systems later. And then I want to also write some cool code to sniff packets and maybe send them back. And hopefully we could launch some attacks that way. We could do some replay attacks. We want to also figure out some ways where you can just immobilize vehicles straight up so that they can't go anywhere. We also want to explore some more ADAS vulnerabilities, perhaps some wireless vulnerabilities. And most importantly, we want to have fun. Hacking is all about fun. We want to end up being this guy on the right. All right, so before we go into the research that we've done, first we're going to be talking a little bit about research that has been done before. So this is a very common type of attack. It's called a replay attack. Basically, the way that it works is, your key fob for your car is essentially a little radio. And so when you hit the button to unlock your vehicle, there's a signal that's sent out, and there's a series of bits, and that series of bits gets compared to almost a database that the car has, or it gets thrown into some kind of hashing function, and the car determines if those series of bits is a valid unlock key. And if it is, then the car unlocks itself. If it isn't, it doesn't do anything. So a replay attack is when you wait for someone to hit that button, that unlock button, and then you record what that key fob sent out. So if the key fob sent out the bits 101, now you know that the key to unlock the car is to send out 101. And so that's what you can do. You can go ahead and replay those bits, send that signal back to the vehicle, and it will actually unlock the vehicle. And you don't need a key fob or anything. You can just do this with standard software-defined radio. And so this is actually very easy to do with a Honda Civic. This is a 2016 model, but it's pretty easy to do, and actually newer models of Honda Civics can also do this. I think they stopped in 2019-ish. But over here you can see in that video that just played, the laptop was actually sending a signal that unlocked the car. That actually turned the car on. And over here, we have another video over here. So they're sending the unlock sequence over to the car, and it's being sent through that little radio that's to the side of the laptop. It gets sent out, and eventually the vehicle unlocks itself. So it's actually pretty easy to break into a car this way. It's also pretty nice for thieves because it's very simple, right? And it doesn't really leave too many marks or anything. So if you're a thief, this is a pretty good way of stealing a Honda Civic. More details on this can be found in the CVE exploit, but that's not the topic for today. That's not the main thing for today. Right now I want to talk a little bit about how cars are actually controlled, right? Because the key fob stuff, that's very cool, but this can only get us into the car, right? So we completed our first objective of getting in a car, but we actually want to start controlling the car. So first we have to have some background on how that is. So cars are controlled through this thing called the CAN bus. The CAN bus is essentially a giant Ethernet wire that spans the length of the vehicle. And it's, just like an Ethernet wire, it has packets that pass through it. And this is the main mode of communications between all the sensors in the vehicle and the rest of the vehicle, right? So, that the data that you read in your dashboard, the data for that is on the CAN bus. It's being sent from the engine control unit all the way to your dashboard. And now you can see what your RPMs are, or your speed or something like that, or your odometer, right? So the CAN bus is basically a giant Ethernet wire, right? And you have all different types of packets. You have different sensors here, so you have the ECU, you have power steering, you have your lights, you have your air conditioning units. And so the thing is, the packets in the CAN bus have all this information, right? So your dashboard, for instance, completely relies on these packets being sent to it, which means that if the packets were somehow corrupted, or they had some malicious data on it, then it could potentially mess up your dashboard. What I'm saying is, if we could send malicious packets over the CAN bus, then we could actually control parts of the vehicle ourselves. Because some parts of the vehicle depend completely upon the CAN signals. So if you control the packets, you control the car. That's the biggest point. That's the biggest thing that we should take away from this slide. There are also some sub-controls that we'll get into later, one of which is called the ADAS system. And this, I forgot what it stands for exactly, but it's like Autonomous Driving Assistance System. And it's basically used for helping you in lane assist or, for instance, adaptive cruise control or something like that, lane departure. And we also have the ECU, the engine control unit. Before we get into the actual attack, let's talk a little bit more about CAN. So again, as I mentioned before, CAN packets are just like Ethernet packets, right? So they have, how an Ethernet packet has an IP address and it has some data and it has a checksum. The CAN packet is essentially the same. The diagram of a standard CAN packet can be seen in the top left over here. So you have a series of arbitration bits. This is your ID. You have some control bits. This just shows whether or not it's a read-only CAN message or if it's a command. You have your data bits over here. This actually reports the data for the CAN packet. And you have CRC, so this is checksum. So basically an example would be that if your engine has an ID of 4, then the arbitration bits should line up to 4. The control, it depends on whether it's a command or read-only message. And the data would be like, for example, what your engine RPM is, right? That's an example. And then you have your checksums. To the right, you can see a more electrical engineering diagram of the CAN bus. So you have the pin layout. So there are a lot of extraneous pins here that we can use for diagnostics, but really the most important one is pins 6 and 14. These are CAN bus and this is CAN bus high and CAN bus low. The CAN bus itself, physically speaking, is actually 2 wires. That's why we have a low wire and a high wire. And so that's why we have 2 pins for those. Down here in the bottom left, this is a diagram of the ADAS system. Again, we'll get into the ADAS system a little bit later. But it's essentially, in most cases, a camera that's mounted behind your windshield and it's pointing outwards. And we can use this to do, again, lane departure, assisted, or, for example, adaptive cruise control, something like that. And the point is that this system is actually directly connected to the CAN bus, but the system standalone is just really a camera. And then this image in the bottom right is a picture of someone calibrating the ADAS system. So now we're going to get into our first car hacking attempt, right? So attempt number 1. We want to have a naive OBD2 connection. So first of all, OBD2, right? What is that? It's actually the name of this port. So this connection over here, right? It is called OBD2. OBD2 is actually also a protocol. And so it's a protocol used for diagnostics. So a mechanic would probably plug in a device into this port in your vehicle, which, by the way, is most commonly located underneath your steering wheel column. So it's pretty easy access. So a mechanic just plugs something in and then they can read some data, right? So it's typically a diagnostic port. Now, if it's a diagnostic port, if it can read data, if the mechanic can completely debug your car, then it must have access to the CAN bus. Because the CAN bus has all that information. It has the engine RPM, it has how much fuel your engine is using and stuff like that. Some data that a mechanic might be using to repair your vehicle. So it has to have access to the CAN bus. That's very critical. It can also read messages, right? But can it write messages? That's basically the end goal here. Because if we can write messages, we can write data through the OBD2 port, then we can complete our previous objective, which was to control the packets. Because remember, if we control the packets, we control the vehicle. So that's the end goal. But first, before we even get started, we have to figure out how we read from an OBD2 port. So what we did for this project was we bought an ELM327 device. And this is a cheap $15 cable you can buy on Amazon. It has a small microcontroller on it, and it connects from OBD2 to USB, so you can plug it into your computer. So when you plug it in for the first time, nothing really happens. And you read it in a little bit by a little bit, and the connection that you have with the vehicle is a serial connection. So you have to send serial commands through the OBD2 protocol, to request more data. And you read it like one at a time, right? But there are some immediate obstacles. As you can see in this image to the right, the data that we read is not very pretty. First of all, we only read one line, right? This is the result of requesting data once, and we're only reading one line of data. But this can't be the case. The car can't be just saying one thing at a time. I mean, it's saying thousands of things at a time. There are hundreds of sensors, and they're all talking over the CAN bus. So it doesn't make sense for there to just be one message. Obviously, we are not reading all the messages at once. It seems as if we're only reading one at a time. So the data is ugly, it's not labeled or anything, and we're only reading it one at a time. So it's actually pretty difficult to automate this and to read in all this data. And it actually gets worse. So we could get to a point where we could read 32 bytes at a time with a little bit of automation, but even with that, we actually hit a buffer limit on our ELM327 device, and the buffer was 32 bytes. So we couldn't read more than 32 bytes at a time. You can see over here on the left, this is a dump of data that we got from a Toyota Tacoma, my truck. And over here you can see there's some data that's being dumped out, but then you see buffer full at the end, and that's because the buffer became full, so you can't read any more data. You can see over here to the right, we send these commands, ATZ, A1, and these commands would send over serial to retrieve the data. And again, you get like some data, this is pretty good, and it would come by really fast, but you'd run out of space. So we could only read a certain amount of time, a certain amount of bytes at a time. So this serial connection is not very good. It's actually quite difficult to deal with. So like any good computer science student, we discovered that the solution is to steal code. So there's actually a guy in Germany, his name is No Really, and on GitHub he created basically a system to automate the process of sending all of these serial commands. So he wrote a program in C, and essentially it's just like a while loop that sends these commands over serial and constantly asks for more data and clears the buffer every single time. So now before, where we could only read in 32 bytes at a time, now we can read an infinite amount of bytes at a time, because as we were reading the 32 bytes from the buffer, we delete everything in the buffer and then we request for another 32 bytes. So this is actually pretty good for us. This is a sort of automation. So the data retrieval is fast, but again, at this point, like we're making progress, but the problem now is that the ELM 327 itself has a slow processor. And if this code is relying on that processor to, clear the buffer and then get more data and then clear the buffer and get more data, if it's not fast enough to do that, then our data retrieval, however fast it might be to us as humans, is not fast enough to read in all the CAN messages that are actually happening. But for now, this is pretty good. The data is clean now because we can use the CAN utils package, which is it's a package on Ubuntu, you can download it. Funnily enough, we thought that the CAN utils package was designed for car hacking, but it turns out that CAN is used a lot in robotics as well. So that's the main purpose of it. But we're using it for car hacking in this instance. But yeah, now the data is clean and we can read in a lot of it at a time. So now it's up to us to interpret the data, right? So we thought to ourselves, all right, well now we have all this data from the vehicle, what can we do with it, right? So we decided to do some investigation. We wanted to figure out what the arbitration bits for specific controls in the vehicle were. For example, what is the arbitration bit for the gas pedal or the brake pedal or the steering column, right? So we did a lot of investigation. We basically read in data from the CAN bus, and then we would turn the steering wheel and we would see which packets would change significantly. And we eventually found that our specific the ID of the steering wheel was 238 for our particular testing vehicle. So I actually used my roommate's Mercedes E300 for this, which he very kindly lended to me for this night. And so this is our code. So all this code is doing is it's really listening. It's constantly requesting for data packets from the CAN bus, and then it's filtering out those data packets by the 238 CAN bus ID. So we're only reading in steering wheel column values, and then we go to the data bits of that CAN frame, and we have to interpret those. So we found that there's a bit for turning left or right, there's a bit for rotation in degrees. And so we filtered all this out, and we could actually read in whether or not we were turning to the right or turning to the left. And we use this information to play Mario Kart, because that's the most valuable use of our time, basically. We could use the steering wheel information to play Mario Kart. And it is actually possible to do this. It's not advisable financially speaking, because we are using some gas. You can see over here on the left-hand side, we have one more bar of gas than on the left, than on the right. But it's still pretty cool. We'll skip to the middle of this video here. You can see though that it is actually working. So on the left-hand side, my friend Bobby, he's turning the steering wheel, and as you can see on the right, it's the OBD2 port is connected through that ALM 327 device over from the car to my laptop, and then my laptop is running a legally obtained Nintendo DS emulator, running a very legitimate copy of Mario Kart DS. And you can see the steering wheel is turning around and the car is actually turning in the video game. So this is actually pretty cool because we're using this car, our real car, as a computer, as like almost like a really expensive Xbox controller. So it's pretty cool. Now reading from the canvas is very impressive and all, and we can play Mario Kart all day. But our main objective is that we wanted to write to the canvas, right? We wanted to write through the OBD2 protocol. Because again, if we control the packets, we control the car, right? Again, that is the motto. So we wanted to start writing packets over to the vehicle. So at this point, we went home. It was summer vacation. So I went home to my house, and we had this Honda CR-V. And the Honda CR-V is from 2008. It's pretty old. It doesn't have too many protections or anything like that for the CAN bus. And so what we could do is we could read in data from the CAN bus, and we could particularly read in the steering wheel and also the gas pedal information. So we would basically stomp on the gas for a little bit, and we would see which data fields would change. So we read in that, and then we saw on the dashboard that as you press on the gas, your tachometer goes up. So we made it our objective to try to change the value of the dashboard. So we could change the needle and make it move around. So this is basically the process that we use to do that. First, you read in all of the CAN data, and with no really's script, we could do that very easily and have everything be nicely formatted. So you had CAN 0, that's the interface, and you had the second column, which is full of IDs, and then you had the data bits over here. From there, we basically filter out what the ID of our particular victim is. In this case, it was the dashboard, it was the tachometer in the dashboard. It was 4E0. And then what we can do is we can make some fake numbers for the data field. So we got 240044 OC. And we encode this in UTF-8, and we can also put in our own ID, and then we can print this out. And we could do this in a while loop for a certain number of times. So we can make a log file that has like 300 of these messages, or maybe like 3,000 of these messages. And a neat thing that we can do with the CAN utils package is we can actually replay log files. So, if you want to read in CAN data, you can save it as a log file. If you want to play the CAN data, you can play the log file. So we'd save this data in a modded log file, and then we use CAN replay to log the data back to the car via the OBD2 port. And it was actually pretty successful.
Oh, shit. That is crazy.
Yeah, so over here in this video, I wanted to show the reaction, but I guess the volume of the video is pretty low. But basically we were successful, right? So we could actually read in the data for the dashboard. We figured out the arbitration bit for that dashboard. Then we modded the data and we sent it back in. So the engine is actually off in this instance. That's why it always goes down to 0 when we aren't sending data. But when we are, it is jittering around. Now ideally what should happen is that tachometer, that needle should go to 4 and it should stay there. Or it should go to 3 and stay there. It should be somewhere and it should be constant. But again, the problem is that with our ELM327 device, the processor was just not fast enough to send commands faster than 20 milliseconds at a time. And so that needle was constantly fighting to be pushed down because the car knows that it's off. So we're actually fighting with the car's signals. We're trying to tell the car that it's revving itself, but the car is trying to tell itself that no, you're actually fine. So the tachometer gets a little bit confused and the needle goes around. But it is a funny prank nonetheless. If you're driving on the highway and you see your needle fly around, it'll probably scare you. But again, the ELM327 processor is a little bit too slow. And also, because this is an older car, the CAN functionality is a little bit limited, so we couldn't actually do things such as steering controls, because it had only hydraulic steering. So this is cool. Our progress is nice so far, but we want to go to the next step. And the next step is actually hacking real, modern vehicles, because up until now we've just been hacking old cars. We've been hacking the E320, which is from the early 2000s, and we've been hacking the CRV, which is from 2008. So we wanted to hack a new vehicle. We wanted to hack my truck. It was a 2021 model, Tacoma. And we ran into an issue. When we were reading in the CAN data from the truck, we could only read in specific IDs. We couldn't read all the IDs as opposed to older vehicles. And this is because the cars nowadays have something called a gateway. The gateway is essentially a firewall, right? And it can block certain IDs that mechanics don't really need to see. So it makes it a little bit more difficult for us to hack it, but we can still hack this, all right? It's just gonna be a little bit more extra work. But yeah, there is really no way to get past a gateway other than ripping up the dashboard and physically tapping into the wires behind it. So our solution is to switch gears a little bit and go into ADAS. And now we can go to ADAS, which is located on the roof, so we can rip that off the roof and connect to it. So again, here's a nice little opening to ADAS. ADAS is it's used for autonomous driver assistance. I think that's what it stands for. It controls functionalities of the vehicle. So for example, if you're driving a car and you're a little bit sleepy and you start drifting to the side, the ADAS system can detect that and it can steer your car back into your lane. Or if somebody stops right in front of you really, really quickly, your ADAS system can actually brake the vehicle for you. It's called adaptive cruise control, or collision avoidance. Now, because the ADAS system has this much direct functionality and control over your vehicle, it must have unrestricted access to CAN by definition, because otherwise it can't send those messages. And even if it's not through CAN, it's through something that controls the vehicle. So as long as we get access to that, then we can control the vehicle. Because if we pretend to be the ADAS system, and we send our own ADAS signals to speed up the car, or slow it down, or make it turn around and desert you, then you can, I guess, control the vehicle this way through the ADAS system. So we did some preliminary research on the truck. So we took apart the cover of the ADAS system. We looked at it. We were like, all right, what does it look like? Well, over here you can see the ADAS camera. This big black box, and it has two connectors to it. It has some power connectors and it has some data pins. You can see that not all of these pins are actually filled in. There are 3 pins over here that are kind of empty, but the majority of them are filled in. We can hook into the ADAS system by using jumper wires, and these are pretty easy to get your hands on. It's just part of any DIY electronics kit. You can get a bunch of jumper cables. And you can plug these into an oscilloscope or something to read in the values. And this way, you can actually read in the data from your vehicle. Now, unfortunately, this is as far as we got for this project. As of now, I haven't yet looked at the data coming from each of the pins. We haven't had a chance to hook up an oscilloscope to the truck, but we can at any point if we're just near a power outlet, I guess. But the plan is to first figure out which pins are connected to the CAN bus. Then we have to read in the values of those pins. Maybe we can conduct a replay attack. And we also need to have some kind of device that can read in from those pins. So like a Raspberry Pi or an Arduino or something. Something that can read in with GPIOs. And yeah, we can do a replay attack and see if we can actually move the vehicle this way. And this way we'd be bypassing the gateway. So that gateway doesn't have anything on us. And it's very cool to do all this sort of very advanced car hacking where we break into the OBD2 port or the CAN bus and the ADAS system. But all of this is really technical and complicated and not very practical, quite honestly. So there are other ways of hacking a vehicle that don't actually require you to be inside the vehicle. First of all, because you have an ADAS system, it's just a camera. You can actually just put a piece of tape over the camera and it'll totally mess up your car. So when you're driving on the highway, the camera might be a little bit blocked because of the tape, and it might think that somebody is in front of it, and it'll actually brake really hard if your car doesn't have external radar sensors. But something else that you can do to trick your vehicle is actually you can wear some special shirts. So these people were university researchers in China, and they actually developed a shirt with a special pattern that would trick human recognition. So this pattern over here, it tricked the AI into believing that this isn't a person. So what you can do is you can, maybe pull a funny prank and have your friend wear that shirt or something and stand in front of a car. Now, it wouldn't really be a very safe prank to do at all, so don't actually do that. But, the point is that the AI system might have a difficult time detecting a human. And so you can use this to do some hacking as well. But if we do end up getting inside a vehicle, if we do the hard work, we still don't even have to break into ADAS to do any complicated sort of attack. We can hook up to OBD2, and we can actually send packets, even if we can't send direct commands to the engine control unit. You see, a special characteristic of the OBD2 protocol is that, and of CAN messages in general, is that values or CAN frames with a lower value for the arbitration bit have higher priority. So for example, your engine has an arbitration bit of maybe like 1 or 2 or 3, right? But your left blinker probably has an arbitration bit of like 300, right? So it's not really, those systems are not as critical, so their value is lower, their priority is lower. So if you send a bunch of CAN packets with an ID of 0, 0 is the highest ID. So you can actually end up DDoSing the vehicle. You can have some garbage data in the back, but as long as you have an ID of 0, that's the only packet that your car will listen to. If you spam it, it will listen to that as priority. And so this way you can actually DDoS your Toyota Camry. It's pretty cool. And this is actually, it's a system that's built into the CAN, so you literally cannot avoid it. It's pretty cool, actually. There are some other ways of getting into a vehicle. It doesn't even require physical access, and that is Bluetooth vulnerabilities. Every car nowadays has Bluetooth, right? But the Bluetooth that you got out of the lot a couple of years ago is not the Bluetooth that's around today, right? So your Bluetooth version in your vehicle has to be outdated. And there have to be, a bunch of exploits that you can use between now and then for that. So it's pretty cool. You can do a lot of things there. So here's some conclusions about what we've done today. Right, so number one, we found out that car hacking is actually pretty fun. It's pretty doable. You can do this for just like $15, really. $15 in an Ubuntu installation. We can enter your car by replaying your key fob. So that's step one complete. You want to get in car, you can just do replay attack. We also learned that OBD2 gives restricted access to CAN. So you can mess around with it a little bit. You can pretty much read in a lot of signals, but you can't really write too much. You can't really control the vehicle too well. But we also did learn that if we did want to control the vehicle, we could do so via ADAS, because the ADAS system supports critical functions, therefore it cannot be restricted by a gateway, and we can use that to our advantage to hack the vehicle. The ADAS can also be tricked out of an emergency situation given the proper scenario. So like, for example, if you're wearing that shirt, you can trick the system. We also learned that you can pretty much trivially DDoS your vehicle by sending a bunch of packets with the ID 0. It's pretty interesting. But this all begs the question at the end that, okay, car hacking is so simple and stuff, you can do all these cool things, and you play around with these one-ton bullets. But, why do we even have to stop at cars, right? Trains are automated, planes have automatic piloting systems. So you can probably do these types of attacks on those vehicles as well. So it's actually very important that we take lessons learned from car security, vehicle security, and we apply it to other, mass transport vehicles like trains and planes and buses and stuff. Maybe subways. But yeah, that's all we have for this project. This is my bibliography. At the end, I'd like to thank Yusuf Atea, Nicholas Goutworth, Mohammed Khawam, Rajat Patel, Philip Oko, Adam Paulina, and the rest of the Rutgers Security Club for helping me out with this hack. This is a team effort, and we did a lot of good stuff, a lot of good research, and hopefully we'll do more research on this later, in the future, near future. And thank you.